I never torture my guests by making them sit through me summarizing either their biography or their book, because I'll get things wrong and you'll know I got them wrong and we'll just be sitting here and it'll be awkward. So if you would give esteemed audience kind of an overview of your background, and we'll go from there.
Oh, wow. Well, there's quite a lot of it because I'm so old now. But just thinking about in terms of my literary productions, my books, I was trying to count up the other day how many books I've written, and it's I lost count somewhere between 49 and 53. So it's somewhere in the low 50s, which is quite a lot of books. Too many books, maybe. And in that 53, I've written books for adults. I've written adult crime novels and also adult nonfiction. And I've written books for quite small children, picture books. Haven't ever quite written those books, that toddlers, the padded ones that toddlers wipe their drool on. But that might be my destiny one day, with a picture of a carrot on every page. But I suppose most of my books are broadly in the YA kind of area. So most of my books are aimed at teenagers. Although I've also written at least 15 books for middle grade. So there's essentially nothing I haven't stooped to in my time. But it's not the kind of career I thought I would originally have. I spent a lot of time studying at college. I did various degrees. I did a PhD for a while. I always thought that my destiny would be to write, to get a job teaching in a university somewhere and maybe write one literary novel a decade. So I never quite realized I'd be a writer mainly for children, churning out book after book after book. Okay, that's me and my world.
Well, you have such a fascinating background. I've got questions about your origin. Of course, we're also going to get into Dogs of the Deadlands, which was just released here September 13th, esteemed audience. You could pull up Dogs of the Deadlands while we're talking and get your copy from the library, order it. By God, you're not going to want to miss it. But I noticed that you had originally had a PhD in the history of beauty. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, it was. My background is basically philosophy, and so I wrote a book about the way in which philosophers and also writers wrote and thought about physical beauty. The different kind of philosophical and aesthetic ideas get built into that idea of physical attractiveness. Now, I mainly looked at literary sources. So there's a chapter on James Fenimore Cooper, the great American novelist. Other chapters on Gothic fiction, and so. Yeah, not the kind of thing that's particularly useful, but it was a fun thing to study.
Well, I saw that and I thought, well, now if you were a cover artist, that makes 100% sense.
Sadly not.
I mean, does that give you, if you're writing about the perception of beauty within literature, that makes more sense.
Yeah, I guess. But it didn't. I mainly did the PhD to get myself a job teaching universities, and I had a couple of interviews, blew the interviews, never quite got the job at a university. Ended up doing the kind of boring job that every teenager dreads and fears. I was actually working for the government as a civil servant in a boring office with a big pile of files and a big book of instructions. But there, I suppose, because my day job was so boring, I felt it perhaps freed up my imagination. And so that's really when I started to write creatively, when my real life was so dull. Maybe that's a common picture with authors.
There's our first tip for writers: get the most boring possible day job you can. Your imagination will explode.
Well, I do think there's if you derive a lot of fulfillment from your day job, then that might suck out some of that creative energy. So if I'd had a better job, I may well never have written anything apart from the terrible adolescent poetry, which is always my first love.
Most writers have got some terrible adolescent poetry someplace. I've got a whole.
I guess we do.
It's not published. It doesn't need to be. It was enough just to have existed at the time. It's fine. So I had read that prior to 9 years old, you're not reading anything, and then a teacher gives you a copy of The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, well, it's not quite true that I didn't read anything. I was a typical horrible little boy. That what I cared about was war and also animals. So there's my two great loves as a small kid. So I read lots of nonfiction. I've got somewhere here behind me in my bookshelf. There's where have you gone now? Oh, I'll never find it. It's a book called the Guinness Book of Animal Facts and Feats, which is like the Guinness Book of Records. It's like that, but about animal stuff. So it's got the man-eating tiger that ate the most people, and it's that kind of gory fact. And so my head was full of that kind of material. But I'd never really read any fiction at all until the teacher gave me The Lord of the Rings. And it wasn't even The Hobbit, it was the daddy version. And because I hadn't really read any fiction, I didn't really know what fiction was. And I had to learn to read fiction and novels through that process of reading The Lord of the Rings. It probably took me 3 years to get through it for the first time. But then for the following years, I just used to read it again and again and again until I was in my mid-teens, and I moved on finally. But yeah, so that was always my kind of start in the fictional world.
So 2-3 years, it takes you to get through it, but by God, you do it. The hobbits, they eat, they walk, they eat, they walk, they sing. And this, at this point, I'm imagining you crawling and then starting to walk a little bit and then running, because somewhere in there you take off and go on, and you're going to be studying the depictions of beauty within fiction and becoming a writer yourself. So when does that click? When does that switch flip for you?
Well, it's interesting. Now, obviously, there's this huge genre of YA, young adult literature, which is aimed at teenagers and those a little older. But that didn't quite exist in the same way back in the 1980s when I was a teenager. So what I made the leap from books like The Lord of the Rings to the kind of adult fiction that appeals to teenagers. So science fiction, I read a lot of. Stephen King was a very important author to me in those formative teenage years. So it's also, I read Joseph Heller's Catch-22 when I was 16, which again filled my head with these comic potentialities of life. So it was more that kind of, the sort of adult fiction that does appeal to teenagers was my next step after that.
Gotcha. So that captures your imagination, lights a little spark that becomes a roaring fire somewhere in there through the teenage years, that by the time you get university, you're more or less all in. You're planning to teach and write literary novels, right?
Oh, I guess so. Although it's I don't know, it's always tempting to try and find those roots of the current you in your past. I just don't know to what extent you could have seen me at 16 or 18 or 21 and seen the me at 57. There's so many different paths that one might have gone down in life. So I don't know. Also, he was like most adolescent boys, I was fairly, in many ways appalling, selfish and egotistical and monstrous in many ways. Whereas now, as you can see, I'm a good guy. And we all say that, don't we?
I think monstrous in many ways is a description that can apply to most teenage boys. Certainly me. many of the teenage boys I was friends with. So there we are. We were monsters together. It was lovely. Yeah. Well, I'm reading your bio and I'm thinking, okay, well this makes sense. You're writing your terrible poetry. You get turned on to fiction. Yep, that all seems straightforward. And then I read, nope, I was also a nightclub bouncer. That's an unusual job for each type.
Yeah, it surprises people who meet me now. But it was when I was doing, among my degrees, I was doing a master's degree at Manchester University, a kind of gritty northern town in England, and not living on very much money. And I just applied for this job at a nightclub. I didn't quite realize it was going to be a doorman. So did you have does the term bouncer mean the same in the United States? So it means that the guy on the door.
100%. Here, it's a tough guy that will throw you out of the club if you're misbehaving.
Yeah, that was me. Yes. And I was never that tough, but I was quite, quite tall and quite, in those days, quite kind of ripped. Can I say that? But also, so I applied for this job, and it was the salary back then was £10 an hour. This is back in the late 1980s, which even now is not it's now the minimum wage in the UK is about £10 an hour. So it was riches back then. And also the day after I joined as a sort of most lowly bouncer, all the other doormen in the place were headhunted by a better club just a bit further down the street. So I became the head doorman. So I got even more money. I was up to £15 an hour there. But also I didn't have to do very much actual brutalization of the customers. I had my guys I could send in to do the beating up. So that was all quite good as well. But yeah, I was never a particularly convincing bouncer, I have to say that.
Well, I imagine in some nights you come in, you got an extra bit of extra aggression. Like, you know what? Stand down. I'll handle this one.
Maybe.